The radio crackled once, then went silent. In the operations center at Bagram Airfield, 17 sets of eyes fixed on the same flickering screen. The pilot's transponder had vanished 4 minutes ago, swallowed by the Hindu Kush like so many before her. Major Vasquez stood with his arms crossed, jaw tight, watching the empty grid square where Captain Marlowe, widow, Kessler's A-10 Thunderbolt should have been. The forward operating base 20 miles north had called in contact with a mechanized Taliban column, and Widow had been their only close air support. Now she was gone. The static hissed like a living thing, filling the room with its accusation. Someone coughed. Someone else whispered a prayer. Vasquez said nothing, but his fingers drummed against his bicep in a rhythm that matched his pulse. 4 minutes could mean anything. Equipment failure, shot down, captured, dead. The possibilities cycled through his mind like a slideshow he couldn't stop. Outside, the afternoon sun blazed over the tarmac, turning the asphalt into a shimmering lake of heat. Inside, the air conditioning hummed, but sweat still beaded on foreheads. The room smelled like coffee, electronics, and fear. Then the radio hissed again. Not static this time, something else. A voice, faint and distorted, threaded through layers of interference like a ghost trying to remember how to speak. Phantom, actual, widow, inbound. The words were barely coherent, stretched thin across damaged circuits and mountain interference. Vasquez stepped forward, pressing the headset tighter against his ear. Say again, widow, confirm status. Silence. Then, clearer now, cutting through the noise like a blade, target destroyed. The room exhaled as one, but Vasquez didn't move. His eyes stayed locked on the screen, waiting for the transponder to bloom back into existence, waiting for confirmation that the pilot who'd been written off moments ago had just pulled herself back from whatever hell she'd been flying through. The seconds stretched. 10, 20, 30. And then there it was. A single green diamond flickering into life on the grid, moving southwest at 200 knots. Widow was coming home. The story of how Captain Marlowe Kessler earned her call sign wasn't one she told willingly. It lived in the margins of official reports and the whispered conversations of squadron mates who'd seen her fly and couldn't quite reconcile the woman with the machine. She'd come up through the reserves, flying combat search and rescue in an Air National Guard unit before transitioning to attack aviation. That alone raised eyebrows. Women in A-10 cockpits were rare enough. Women who chose the Warthog over faster, sleeker platforms were rarer still. The A-10 was ugly, slow, and built around a gun so massive it could rip tanks apart from a mile away. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't break sound barriers or star in recruitment videos. It was a truck with wings, designed to get low, get dirty, and keep flying even when everything else fell apart. Marlowe loved it precisely because everyone else underestimated it. She'd earned her wings the hard way, flying through prejudice disguised as concern, through questions about upper body strength and emotional stability, through evaluations that scrutinized her twice as hard for half the credit. By the time she reached Afghanistan, she'd logged more combat hours than most of the men who outranked her. But none of that mattered in the ready room. What mattered was the mission. What mattered was the soldiers on the ground who needed her guns, her eyes, her willingness to fly lower than anyone else dared. The call sign came during her second deployment. A Marine patrol had been ambushed in the Korangal Valley, pinned down in a dried riverbed with insurgents on 3 sides and a mortar team zeroing in on their position. Marlowe had been wheels up in 6 minutes, screaming toward the valley at full throttle while her wingman struggled to keep pace. When she arrived, the situation was worse than briefed. The Marines were surrounded, taking fire from hardened positions dug into the mountainside. Standard procedure called for marking the targets, coordinating with ground controllers, and making high-speed gun runs from a safe altitude. Marlowe did none of that. She dropped low, so low the Warthog's shadow raced across the rocks beneath her, and she held the trigger down until her 30mm cannon turned the mountainside into dust and screaming metal. She made 3 passes, each one lower than the last, eating small arms fire like raindrops, ignoring the alarms screaming in her cockpit, ignoring her wingman's frantic calls to pull up. When she finally climbed out, trailing smoke from a dozen holes in her fuselage, every hostile position had been silenced. The Marines walked out alive. That night back at base, her squadron commander had looked at her with something between awe and exasperation and said, "You fly like you're already dead." Like some kind of widow who's got nothing left to lose. The name stuck. But there was more to it than recklessness. Marlowe flew with a precision that bordered on supernatural. She could read terrain like a book, anticipate enemy movements before they happened, and put ordnance on target with an accuracy that made senior pilots shake their heads in disbelief. She wasn't suicidal. She was surgical. The difference mattered, though it took most people a while to see it. Her approach to combat was rooted in something deeper than adrenaline or bravado. She flew like someone who understood that hesitation cost lives, that altitude was safety for the pilot but death for the soldiers below, that the machine could take more punishment than anyone believed if you trusted it enough. The A-10 was designed to absorb damage and keep fighting. So was she. Over time, Widow became shorthand for a particular kind of mission. When the situation was desperate, when the enemy was too close and the margin for error too thin, when conventional tactics had failed and someone needed to fly into the teeth of hell and come back smiling, they called Widow. She never said no. The operations center at Bagram had settled into tense anticipation by the time Widow's A-10 appeared on the horizon. The sun hung low, painting the mountains in shades of amber and rust, and the Warthog came in fast, lower than regulation, trailing a thin stream of smoke from her starboard engine. Vasquez stood on the tarmac with his arms crossed, watching the approach, counting the seconds until she touched down. The landing gear deployed late and the bird hit the runway hard, tires screaming against asphalt, the nose bucking slightly before settling. She rolled to the end of the strip and turned toward the maintenance hangars, the wounded engine coughing black smoke into the golden light. By the time Marlowe climbed down from the cockpit, a crowd had gathered. Maintenance crews swarmed the aircraft, cataloging damage, and what they found made strong men wince. 17 bullet holes stitched across the fuselage. A jagged tear in the left wing where shrapnel had punched through. Hydraulic fluid leaking in slow, steady drips. The starboard engine housing cracked and scorched. The canopy glass spiderwebbed on one side. And somehow, impossibly, the bird was still flying. Marlowe pulled off her helmet and ran a hand through sweat-soaked hair. She was 31 but looked older in that moment, her face lined with exhaustion and something else, something harder to name. Vasquez approached, his expression unreadable. "You want to tell me what happened up there?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge underneath, the kind that came from relief mixed with fury. Marlowe looked at him, then at her aircraft, then back. Lost comms after the first pass. Took fire from a ZU-23, fragged the gun position and rolled in on the armor. By the time I splashed the last technical, half my instruments were dead. She said it matter-of-factly, like she was describing a grocery run. Vasquez studied her for a long moment. "You should have aborted. Marines needed me. You could have been killed, but I wasn't." The two of them stood there, locked in a silent contest of wills until Vasquez finally shook his head. "You're grounded until maintenance clears that bird, minimum 3 days. Marlowe opened her mouth to argue, then thought better of it. She nodded once, sharp, and turned to walk away. Vasquez watched her go, then looked back at the A-10. The ground crew chief, a grizzled master sergeant named Torres, stepped up beside him. "She's got a guardian angel, that one," Vasquez grunted. "Or a death wish." Torres shook his head, running a hand along the bullet-scarred wing. "Nah, sir, she's just good, real good. And she knows that bird'll take her home no matter what." 3 days passed like molasses. Marlowe spent them in mandatory debriefs, paperwork, and forced downtime that felt like punishment. She ran the perimeter fence in the pre-dawn darkness, did push-ups until her arms shook, and sat in the wrecked tent staring at a book she couldn't focus on. Other pilots came and went, flying their missions, logging their hours. She watched the boards, tracked the ops, and felt the itch in her fingers that came from being grounded. On the third evening, she found herself in the maintenance hangar, standing beside her A-10 while Torres and his crew worked under the wings. They'd patched the holes, replaced the damaged engine, and were running systems checks. The bird looked better, almost whole again, though the scars remained visible beneath the fresh paint. Torres noticed her standing there and wiped his hands on a rag. "She'll fly, Captain. Better than new." Marlowe nodded, reaching out to touch the fuselage like she was checking on an old friend. "Thanks, Chief. You take care of her, she'll take care of you. That's how it works," she smiled faintly. "I know." That night, lying in her bunk, she thought about the mission, the radio going dead, the anti-aircraft fire chewing through her wing, the way the world had narrowed to the gun sight and the trigger, and the certainty that if she didn't finish the job, good people would die. The next mission came 2 weeks later, but it started with a conversation nobody expected. Marlowe was sitting in the briefing room with 5 other pilots, nursing bad coffee and half listening to the intelligence officer drone on about enemy movements, when Captain Reeves, a young hotshot flying F-16s out of Kandahar, leaned over and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Must be nice flying a plane that's slower than a helicopter. Real low-stress work." The room went quiet. Marlowe didn't look up from her notes. Reeves grinned, encouraged by the silence. "I mean, no offense, but the A-10's basically a flying museum. When are they gonna retire that thing and give you a real jet?" Marlowe set down her pen slowly, deliberately. When she finally looked at Reeves, her expression was calm, almost pleasant. "You ever been shot at, Captain?" Reeves blinked. "Sure, couple times." "How many holes did your jet take?" None. That's kind of the point. Don't get hit." Marlowe nodded thoughtfully. "Right, don't get hit. Stay fast, stay high, stay safe." She let that hang in the air for a moment. "Here's the thing about the Hog. She's slow because she's low. She's low because the soldiers down there need her close. And she takes hits because she's willing to trade paint for their lives. You fly a museum, I'll fly a lifeline." Reeves opened his mouth, then closed it. Someone in the back of the room chuckled softly. The intelligence officer cleared his throat and continued the briefing. Later, after the room emptied, Major Vasquez caught Marlowe in the hallway. "You didn't have to embarrass him," she shrugged. "He embarrassed himself." Vasquez sighed. "Look, I know the A-10 community takes a lot of flack, and I know you've had to fight for every bit of respect you've got, but you don't have to prove anything anymore. Your record speaks for itself." Marlowe met his eyes. "Does it? Because I still get pilots like Reeves treating me like I'm flying cargo. I still get questioned every time I make a call in the field, and I still have to be twice as good for half the credit." Vasquez didn't have an answer for that, because it was true. They both knew it. After a long pause, he said, "Next mission is high risk. Convoy escort through the Tangi Valley. Intelligence says there's been increased Taliban activity, possible ambush setup. Your primary CAS. Interested?" Marlowe's expression shifted, the frustration melting into something sharper, more focused. "When do we launch?" "Dawn. Briefing at 0400. She nodded. "I'll be there." As she walked away, Vasquez couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching someone walk toward a destiny already written. The Tangi Valley earned its reputation the hard way. Narrow, winding, flanked by steep ridges perfect for ambush, it had become a killing ground for coalition forces. The Taliban knew every rock, every cave, every firing position. They watched the roads with patience honed over years of asymmetric warfare, waiting for the moment when a convoy slowed, when the spacing between vehicles stretched, when the air cover circled just a little too far away. Marlowe launched at dawn with her wingman, Captain Akoy, flying beside her. The sky was still dark to the west, stars fading as the sun climbed behind the mountains. The 2 A-10s flew in loose formation, their turbofan engines growling through the thin air, their titanium bathtubs protecting the pilots from everything the world below could throw at them. Marlowe's hands rested lightly on the stick and throttle, her eyes scanning the horizon, the terrain, the radio frequencies cycling through her helmet. The convoy was Army, 12 vehicles carrying supplies and personnel to a forward operating base. They'd been on the road for an hour, and so far nothing had happened. But Marlowe could feel it, that electric tension in the air that meant contact was coming. She'd felt it before, dozens of times. It was the way the landscape seemed to hold its breath, the way shadows in the valleys looked deeper, the way the radio chatter from the convoy stayed clipped and professional but carried an undercurrent of nerves. Widow, Phantom 2-1 actual. Convoy is approaching checkpoint Bravo. Request visual confirmation of route. Marlowe keyed her radio. Phantom 2-1 Widow, Roger, moving to overwatch position now. She banked left, dropping altitude, bringing the Warthog down until she was skimming the ridgeline at 300 feet. Below her, the convoy snaked through the valley, Humvees and MRAPs kicking up dust in the early light. Everything looked normal. Too normal. Akoi's voice crackled in her ear. Phantom 2-2. I've got possible fighting positions on the North Ridge, grid 3279 or 41. No visual confirmation of hostiles. Marlowe adjusted her course, bringing her sensors to bear on the coordinates. There, carved into the mountainside, were shallow depressions and rock formations that could hide men and weapons. She circled once, eyes narrowed, looking for the telltale signs. Movement, reflections, heat signatures, nothing. But her instincts screamed otherwise. Phantom 2-1 Widow. I've got eyes on possible ambush positions. Recommend you halt the convoy and let me do a low pass. There was a pause, then, Widow 2-1 actual. Negative, we're behind schedule. Keep overwatch and advise if you see confirmed threats. Marlowe bit back her frustration. Confirmed threats. They always wanted confirmation. As if the enemy would wave a flag before opening fire. She climbed to 500 feet, circling wide, every nerve in her body taut. Akoi mirrored her position on the opposite side of the valley. The convoy rolled forward, entering the narrowest section of the pass. And then the world exploded. The lead vehicle erupted in a fireball as an IED detonated beneath it, flipping the MRAP onto its side and blocking the road. Immediately, machine gun fire raked the convoy from both ridges, green tracers arcing down like lethal rain. RPGs streaked out of the rocks, impacting against armored hulls, and the radio erupted with frantic voices. Contact! Contact! We're taking fire from both sides. 2-1 Bravo is hit. We need medevac. Phantom 2-1 to any air. We need immediate support. Marlowe didn't wait for authorization. She rolled inverted, pulled the nose down, and dove toward the North Ridge, her targeting systems locking onto the muzzle flashes blooming in the rocks. The world narrowed to the pipper in her HUD, the distance shrinking, the trigger under her finger. At 2,000 feet she opened fire. The GAU-8 Avenger roared to life, a sound like the sky tearing itself apart, 30mm rounds chewing through rock and flesh and metal at 70 rounds per second. The ridge exploded in dust and fire, and the incoming fire slackened. She pulled up hard, feeling the G-forces crush her into the seat, and rolled right to set up another pass. Akoi was already engaging the South Ridge, his cannon fire walking up the slope, silencing gun positions one by one. Below, the convoy was trying to recover, soldiers dismounting, returning fire, dragging wounded behind cover. The second pass Marlowe dropped even lower, so close she could see individual figures scrambling through the rocks. She fired again, shorter bursts this time, surgical, taking out a heavy machine gun nest, and then a cluster of fighters regrouping behind a boulder. Tracer fire arced up toward her, and she felt the familiar thump-thump-thump of rounds hitting the airframe. Alarms chirped in her cockpit. She ignored them. Phantom 2-2, I've got more contacts moving up the east side. They're trying to flank the convoy. Akoi's voice was strained. Copy, moving to engage. But before he could reposition, an RPG streaked past Marlowe's canopy, close enough that she saw the smoke trail. She broke hard left, then immediately reversed, bringing her nose back around. The shooter was exposed now, reloading in a shallow depression. She put a burst directly into the position and watched it disintegrate. The battle lasted 9 minutes. By the time the last hostile position was silenced, Marlowe had made 6 gun runs and expended most of her ammunition. Her jet was battered, warning lights glowing across the panel, but still flying. Below, the convoy was shattered but alive. Medics worked on the wounded while security teams swept the ridges. Widow, Phantom 2-1 actual. You just saved our lives, thank you. Marlowe's voice was steady, professional. Glad we were here, 2-1. Medevac is inbound. Hang tight. She climbed back to altitude, her hands shaking now that the adrenaline was fatting. Akoi pulled alongside, and she could see him giving her a thumbs-up through his canopy. She returned the gesture, but inside she was already replaying the fight, cataloging mistakes, calculating how much closer she could have been. how many more lives she might have saved if she'd been faster, better, sharper. It was never enough. It was never perfect, but it was what she had. When they landed back at Bagram, the ground crew chief Torres took one look at her aircraft and whistled low. "Jesus, Captain, you trying to set a record for most holes in one bird." Marlowe climbed down, exhausted, and managed a weak smile. "Just keeping you employed, Chief," he laughed, shaking his head. "You keep flying like this, I'm gonna need a raise." That night Marlowe lay in her bunk and stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the base around her, generators humming, voices in the distance, the occasional roar of a jet launching into the darkness. She thought about the soldiers in that convoy, thought about the ones who'd been wounded, the one who died before medevac arrived. Thought about the invisible line between life and death that she walked every time she climbed into that cockpit. 2 weeks later, the story spread. It started with the soldiers from the convoy, who told anyone who'd listen about the A-10 pilot who'd flown so low they could read the nose art, who'd stayed on station even after taking fire, who turned a massacre into a survivable fight. It moved through the Marine units who'd worked with her before, who added their own stories to the legend. It reached the other pilots, even the ones who'd mocked the warthog, and slowly, grudgingly, attitudes began to shift. Marlowe noticed it in small ways. The nods she got walking through the chow hall, the way conversations paused when she entered a room, not with hostility but with something closer to respect. The junior pilots who started asking her questions about tactics, about flying low-level in combat, about how to manage fear when the bullets were flying. She didn't seek the attention. If anything, it made her uncomfortable. She wasn't flying for glory or recognition. She was flying because soldiers needed her, and because the A-10 could do things no other aircraft could. But the attention came anyway, building quietly until it reached a critical mass. The moment everything changed came during a routine briefing. General McKenna, the Air Wing commander, walked into the room unannounced. Everyone snapped to attention. He waved them down and looked directly at Marlowe. "Captain Kessler," a word. Her stomach dropped. She followed him into the hallway, trying to remember if she'd screwed up some paperwork or bent a regulation too far. McKenna closed the door and studied her for a moment. Then, to her surprise, he smiled. "Relax, Captain, you're not in trouble," she exhaled slowly. "Yes, sir. I've been reading your after-action reports, Tangi Valley, Korangal, a dozen others. You've got more confirmed kills than most fighter squadrons. You've saved more lives than I can count. And you've done it all in an airplane half the Air Force wants to retire." He paused, his expression growing more serious. "Recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross. Your actions in the Tangi Valley were extraordinary and your body of work speaks for itself." Marlowe blinked, stunned. "Sir, thank you, but I was just doing my job. That's what everyone who earns this medal says." McKenna handed her a folder. "There's something else. We're standing up a new training program for close air support pilots. We need someone who understands the mission, who can teach the next generation how to do it right. I want you to lead it." She looked down at the folder, then back up at him. "Sir, with respect, I'd rather stay in the fight." "I know, but Captain, you can't fly forever. Sooner or later, someone's going to get lucky, or the airframe's going to fail, or the odds are finally going to catch up. And when that happens, everything you know, everything you've learned, it dies with you." He let that sink in, then continued. "This isn't about taking you out of the fight. It's about multiplying your impact. One Widow is extraordinary. A squadron of pilots trained by Widow. That changes wars." Marlowe stared at the folder in her hands, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She thought about the soldiers she'd saved, the ones she hadn't, the endless cycle of missions that blurred together into one long, grinding campaign. She thought about the A-10, her battered, beautiful bird that always brought her home. And she thought about what came after, what legacy meant when the fighting finally stopped. "How long do I have to decide, sir?" McKenna's expression softened. "Take a week. Think about it. Talk to your wingman, your crew chief, whoever you trust. But Marlowe, I need an answer. The Air Force needs you. Maybe not in the way you expected, but in the way that matters most." He left her standing in the hallway, holding the folder like it was a live grenade. That night she sat on the roof of the operations building, watching the stars wheel overhead. Torres found her there an hour later carrying 2 cups of coffee. Heard you got offered the instructor gig. She took the coffee without looking at him. Word travels fast. Always does. What were you gonna do? Marlowe was quiet for a long time. I don't know. Torres sipped his coffee and stared out at the flight line. You know what I tell the young mechanics when they ask me why I stay in? I tell them it's not about the planes. It's about making sure the planes can save the people. That's the mission. Doesn't matter if you're turning wrenches or pulling triggers long as you're in the chain. It's not the same, isn't it? You think those pilots you train won't save lives, won't carry forward everything you've learned. Hell, Captain, you'll save more people from a classroom than you ever could from a cockpit, because you'll save the people they save, and the people after that. Marlowe looked at him, really looked, and saw the wisdom in his weathered face. When did you get so philosophical, Chief? He grinned. Spend enough time fixing broken things, you learn a thing or two about what's worth saving. They sat in silence for a while, drinking their coffee, watching the night operations unfold below. Somewhere in the darkness, an A-10 launched on a mission, its engines howling into the void. Marlowe tracked the sound until it faded, and in that moment she made her decision. She would take the assignment, not because she wanted to leave the fight, but because Torres was right. The mission was bigger than any single pilot. It was a chain, each link forged from sacrifice and skill, and the absolute refusal to let good people die when you had the power to stop it. A week later, Marlowe stood in front of 20 young pilots, their faces eager and uncertain, and she began to teach them what she knew. She taught them how to read terrain, how to anticipate enemy movements, how to communicate with ground controllers in the chaos of combat. She taught them the capabilities and limitations of the A-10, the way it could absorb punishment and keep flying, the way its gun could turn the tide of a battle in seconds. But most importantly, she taught them why they flew. Not for glory, not for medals, but for the soldiers on the ground who needed them, who were counting on them, who would live or die based on decisions made at 500 feet and 300 knots. She was relentless, demanding, intolerant of excuses or half measures. She pushed them harder than they thought possible and accepted nothing less than excellence. Some of them resented her for it. But most of them understood eventually that she was trying to keep them alive while teaching them how to save lives. And slowly, the culture began to shift. The A-10 community, long dismissed as the unglamorous stepchild of Air Force aviation, became known for its precision, its toughness, and its absolute commitment to the mission. Pilots who trained under Widow carried her lessons into combat, and those lessons saved lives. Her influence spread beyond her squadron, beyond her base, rippling outward through the entire close air support community. Years passed. Marlowe deployed 2 more times, flying combat missions between training rotations, unable to fully step away from the cockpit. She earned her Distinguished Flying Cross, then an Air Medal with Valor Device, then a promotion to Major. Her call sign became synonymous with a particular philosophy of combat aviation: aggressive, precise, and utterly dedicated to the people on the ground. Other pilots began to emulate her style, to adopt her tactics, to internalize her priorities. The legend of Widow grew, not because she sought it, but because the results spoke for themselves. Eventually, inevitably, she flew her last combat mission. It was unremarkable, a routine patrol over Helmand Province that ended without incident. When she climbed out of the cockpit for the last time, she didn't feel the relief she'd expected. Instead, she felt the strange, hollow ache of ending something that had defined her for so long. Torres was there, as always, supervising the post-flight inspection. "How's she feel, Major?" Marlowe ran her hand along the fuselage one last time, like saying goodbye to an old friend. "You gave her a good run, both of you," she smiled faintly. "We gave each other a good run." That evening the squadron threw her a small ceremony. General McKenna was there, along with dozens of pilots she'd trained and soldiers whose lives she'd saved. They presented her with a plaque, a piece of her aircraft's titanium hull, and more gratitude than she knew how to accept. When it was her turn to speak, Marlowe stood before them and felt the weight of all those eyes, all that respect, all that expectation. "I'm not great with speeches," she began, and a few people chuckled. "But I want you to understand something. The missions we fly, the risks we take, they're not about us. They're about the people who trust us to be there when it matters. Every time you strap into that cockpit, you're making a promise. You're saying, I will not let you down. And that promise is sacred. She paused, her voice steady but her eyes bright. The A-10 isn't the fastest jet, it isn't the prettiest, but it's honest. It does what it says it'll do, it protects people, it saves lives. And if you fly it right, if you commit to the mission the way it deserves, you'll be part of something bigger than yourself. You'll be part of a legacy that outlives any single pilot or aircraft. The room was silent. Then someone started clapping, and the sound built until it filled the space, a thunderous ovation that seemed to shake the walls. Marlowe stood there, feeling the love and respect of her community wash over her, and for the first time in a long time she allowed herself to feel proud. Not of the medals, not of the record, but of the lives saved. The soldiers who went home. The legacy she'd built from skill, sacrifice, and an unshakable belief that every life was worth fighting for. Years later, long after Marlowe had retired and moved to a quiet house in the mountains of Colorado, a young pilot named Lieutenant Amari stood in front of her first A-10, nervous and excited and terrified all at once. Her instructor, a grizzled captain with 1,000 hours of combat time, walked up beside her. Nervous, Amari nodded. Terrified, sir, he smiled. Good, means you respect the mission. You know who used to say that? No, sir. Major Marlowe Kessler, call sign Widow. Best A-10 pilot I ever knew. She taught me everything that matters. He handed Amari a worn notebook, pages filled with handwritten notes, diagrams, tactical concepts. This was hers. She gave it to me when I graduated from her course. Now I'm giving it to you. Amari took the notebook carefully like it was made of glass. She opened it to the first page and read the inscription in neat, precise handwriting. To whoever carries this next, fly low, fly true, bring them home. She looked up at her instructor, eyes wide. I don't know if I can live up to this, sir. Nobody does at first, but you will, because she believed you could, and because the mission demands it. Amari nodded slowly, gripping the notebook tighter. That afternoon, she flew her first training sortie, and as the A-10 climbed into the brilliant blue sky, she thought about the woman who'd flown this same jet, who'd faced the same fears, who'd walked the same path. And she understood, finally, what it meant to be part of something larger than herself. Back in Colorado, Marlowe sat on her porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sun set behind the mountains. The sky was painted in shades of orange and purple, and the air was cool and clean. Somewhere in the distance, she heard the faint rumble of jet engines, a sound so familiar it made her heart ache. She closed her eyes and remembered the feel of the stick in her hand, the roar of the gun, the radio chatter of soldiers calling for help, and the satisfaction of being able to answer. The countless missions, the endless hours, the weight of responsibility that never truly lifted. She remembered the fear, too. The moments when the fire was too close, when the odds were too long, when she wasn't sure she'd make it home. But most of all, she remembered the faces, the soldiers she'd saved, the pilots she'd trained, the crew chiefs who'd kept her flying, the community that had become her family. She opened her eyes and looked at the sky, and she smiled, because the mission continued. It always would. New pilots were flying her routes, protecting new soldiers, carrying forward the lessons she'd learned and the legacy she'd built. The radio might be silent now, but the echo of her call sign still whispered through the airways, a reminder that courage wasn't about being fearless. It was about showing up anyway. It was about making the promise and keeping it, no matter the cost. And as the last light faded from the sky, Marlowe raised her coffee in a quiet toast to all the pilots who'd come before her and all the ones who'd come after, bound together by a single, unbreakable truth. When the call came, they would answer. Every time, without fail, because that was the mission, that was the promise, and some promises were worth everything.